Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Marie Lamy. I work as Director of Partnerships for Access Health International. I'm very pleased to see you in the room today, and also for those of you who are joining us virtually, welcome to this day 2 of our Conclave. I have the pleasure of introducing our first session for today, which is on supply chain resilience. This session is co-hosted by Access Health International, the Duke NUS Center of Regulatory Excellence, or CORE, and United States Pharmacopoeia, who is also our sponsor for this session. So thank you, and grateful to our partners for putting this together with us. So a little bit of background on the topic for this session. Supply chain resilience, when we speak about health systems resilience, often gets overlooked, actually. So I'm pleased that we can have a dedicated session with some great experts in the room to talk it through. COVID-19 challenged global supply chains. We saw that it exposed its vulnerabilities. We saw distribution networks disrupted, demand spiking, that led to raw material shortages, distribution bottlenecks, and also an increased risk of fake medicines and medical products circulating, like fake vaccines that are a risk to everyone's health. The urgency to deliver sometimes overshadows the rigorous processes that are needed to ensure safety and efficacy. So this really emphasized the importance of building robust supply chains. We need to build resilience in our supply chains to ensure uninterrupted access to essential medicines and healthcare products, especially in times of crisis. So what we'll talk about today is how harnessing technology, fostering collaboration across sectors, and ensuring better transparency are all part of the solution. To start us off, I'm very honored to introduce our USP colleagues, both here in the room and also online. We have online Chris Caldwell, dialing in from the United States. Chris is VP of International Government and Regulatory Affairs at USP. He helps a team dedicated to shaping USP's global stance on public policy and regulatory matters. With a rich background spanning the US FDA, Merck & Co., Becton Dickinson, and Bio, Chris combines technical and policy expertise in pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Welcome online, Chris. And I'm also honored to introduce Mr. Anthony Tann, General Manager and Senior Director for Asia Pacific at USP. Anthony has 30 years of experience in healthcare with expertise in general management, strategic planning, and operations. He leads USP's customer engagement, external affairs, and collaborations with public officials here in APAC. Anthony is recognized for his contributions to conferences on building trust in medicine's quality during the COVID-19 pandemic. So Anthony will set the scene for us and tell us more about elements of a strong medicines supply chain. So could I invite you on stage as well, Anthony? You can sit with me. But first, I'll turn over to Chris for some opening words. Over to you, Chris.
The importance of having a secure and resilient pharmaceutical supply chain has always been a top priority. But like so many things, the COVID pandemic revealed vulnerabilities that we have. Looks like I'm going to start by Leo. There we go. Geopolitical tensions that also were compounded by having a concentration of manufacturing, gaps in quality, and market disruptions due to demand spikes and shortages that came across the web. The silver lining, the pandemic also heightened the importance of ensuring that we address these gaps and continue to strengthen a sustainable access to life-saving medicines, and it also provides us an important policy window to implement changes. So and collaborative approaches to improve the security and resilience across various stages of the supply chain, and ultimately to propose some actionable solutions for consideration. So with that brief introduction, I think I'm going to turn it over now to Anthony to get a little deeper comments, and then we'll go on to the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the introduction. Right, it's a pleasure to be here today to talk about elements, okay, of a strong supply chain for medical products. Here's what we'll be talking about. Firstly, a very quick introduction of United States Pharmacopoeia, what we do, how we are involved in the global supply chain for medical products, an overview of the supply chain, very much focusing on the vulnerabilities and disruptions and how quality impacts the integrity of the supply chain, and talk about what the 5 elements of strong medical supply chain as determined by United States Pharmacopoeia. So who is United States Pharmacopoeia? Now, in 1820, a group of 11 physicians formed United States Pharmacopoeia because they realized that there is a need for public standards to improve the quality, safety, and benefits of medicines through public standards. In 1938, under the Federal Drug and Cosmetic Act, United States Pharmacopoeia and the National Formulary was recognized as the official compendia for the safety of drugs and medical products in the United States. Today, over 200 years later, USP standards are recognized in more than 150 countries in the world. We continue our mission today, okay, to responding to public health challenges through our 3 pillars of standards, advocacy, and capability building. In terms of standards, the USP documentary standards and reference standards include drug and active pharmaceutical ingredient monographs, compounding monographs, journal chapters, and journal notices. In advocacy, we continue to engage in public dialogue to provide USP's perspective and expertise in the interest of better public health policies. And in capability building, we help regulators, manufacturers acquire the required skills and knowledge, okay, to advance regulatory strengthening on helping various stakeholders to be able to enable access of quality assured medicines to patients. In USP, okay, it's our people that really drives the work. Okay, our more than 1,200 staff work together with about 1,000 volunteers who are scientific experts and government liaisons. Okay. Together, they are all leaders in their respective fields from industry, academia, regulatory bodies, and other stakeholders. Okay. And work towards contributing to developing standards, okay, to a consensus-driven process achieved through expert committees and expert panels. On the advocacy front, USP is the only pharmacopoeia that is not a government agency. So we are involved in a wide range of activities with international agencies as well as multilateral agencies. We are recognized, okay, and acknowledged as an official and a participant in many global platforms, okay, like the WHO, ICH, APAC Life Sciences Innovation Forum, etc. Now we turn to the supply chain for medical products. Okay. The current supply chain of medical product is a very complex network of systems, as we all know. Anything from the API manufacturers and raw material manufacturers down to the actual manufacturers, okay, who have manufacturing sites all over the world, through to the distribution systems where you have wholesalers, distributors, resellers, purchasing organizations, etc. Okay, down to the healthcare providers, that actually when you have hospitals, clinics, public health centers, before it actually gets to the patient. Okay. What this means is the whole system is subject to a lot of potential vulnerabilities, systemic vulnerabilities, right? And this can be anything from poor manufacturing, insufficient regulation. It is very difficult for regulators to regulate, okay, and enforce in such a complex system. And then, of course, the lack of transparency within the whole medicine supply chain. At the same time, we have disruptions, okay? Whether it's an earthquake somewhere, unfortunate earthquake, a war somewhere, or the pandemic, like the COVID-19 pandemic, these impact, okay, the supply, the access of quality assured medicines to patients. Okay? Leads to a lot of long-lasting shortages, product recalls, etc. Okay, price increases, as we all have seen over the past years, okay, as well as the increased potential for substandard and falsified medicines. Now, this data may be a little bit old, okay, but I think it is really something which is still very much true, and in fact, it may even be exacerbated by the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can see that from in 2013, the European Association for Hospital Pharmacies reported that more than 40%, 43% of drug shortages is due to quality issues. And in 2019, FDA study had shown that quality issues impact shortages in more than 62%. That's a very, very high percentage. Right. So what do we do, right? Okay, in terms of USP, we look at the 5 elements of having a strong supply chain, a medicine supply chain. Okay, look at ingredient and product quality assurance, regulatory capability, supply chain security, supply chain transparency, and manufacturing capabilities. Now, okay, first we talk about ingredient and product quality assurance. Now, we cannot have a strong supply chain without the basic unit, right? Okay, the strong quality and safe medicines flowing through the supply chain. Many countries, as we know, have manufacturers to comply with pharmaceutical standards, okay? And this is really to protect patient safety and public health. Okay? And these standards help regulators and the industry to ensure continued access of quality medicines and to monitor for substandard and falsified medicines. Okay, this means that quality and safety of medical products, as they flow through the entire supply chain, from raw material suppliers, API and raw material suppliers, okay, all the way through the manufacturers, all the way down to the patients, okay? And USP has standards that cover every single part of the supply chain. Then we talk about regulatory capabilities. Strong regulatory systems, okay, is required, okay, especially when as I mentioned, because of the complex supply chain, strong regulatory capability it's a real challenge for regulators, okay? So really, to be able to strengthen regulatory systems in order to enforce, okay, to ensure that the medicines that flow through the supply chain are quality assured and safe. Right? So for USP, we do a lot of regulatory strengthening in the various countries in the world, right? Many countries, okay, require that manufacturers comply to pharmacopoeia standards like the USP, okay, and other pharmacopoeias to protect the patients. Our established partnerships with national regulatory authorities, within the industry, with academia and other stakeholders, give us a very unique insight as to where the challenges are, and therefore being able to establish programs, okay, for regulatory strengthening in these various countries. Okay. In addition, our global public health group programs, okay, work on combating substandard and falsified medicines through capability building throughout the globe, and especially in low and middle income countries. In terms of supply chain security, now there's a few data here that I wanted to present, wanted to show, right? WHO, okay, has estimated that about 10.5% of medicines worldwide are substandard and or falsified. Okay. An article that came up in the JAMA, okay, in Journal of I can't remember what JAMA stands for. Okay, in JAMA has identified that 16% of essential medicines tested in low and middle income countries, okay, fail quality criteria. And you can see the various regions. Asia, looking at Asia, our region, about 13.7%. And in fact, a report from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimates that in Southeast Asia, consumers spend anything between $520 million to $2.6 billion on substandard and falsified medicines. Okay, that's a lot. The impact is really, really tremendous. Okay. A survey that was done by APEC, APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Forum, Life Science, during the Center of Excellence workshop on supply chain integrity shows that manufacturers, regulators, okay, about 92%, okay, identified quality substandard and falsified medicines as an issue, right? So, long and short of it all, you can see the impact of the prevalence, actually, and the impact of substandard and modified medicines, and how it is such a major concern, okay, Now, the US FDA, in collaboration with various Asia-Pacific economic, the 21 countries of the Asia-Pacific Economic Community, working together with WHO, USP, regulators, and academia, okay, to create a supply chain security toolkit for medical products. Okay. Now, this toolkit offers comprehensive guidelines, technical discussions, samples, and tools to support implementation of post-market surveillance programs, including sections addressing quality testing, sampling, and global evidence-based data on poor quality products. Now, the APEC has named USB as a center of excellence for this dissemination, the training of the USB, of the APEC APEC security, supply chain security toolkit. So you can actually download this, take a look at this from the USB website. Now, supply chain transparency is next. Now, having a line of sight, okay, of important information throughout the whole supply chain, okay, is it's really important to be able to have traceability on where the potential vulnerabilities are going to be. Now, if we look at normally in the downstream, you probably have more information, especially from where the manufacturers going to the different wholesalers, distributors, but where information is really, really very much less visible is really on the upstream, right? From the API suppliers, raw material suppliers to the manufacturers. Right? And on top of it all, information data throughout this whole chain information is really very fragmented and not standardized. Right? So what USP has done is really to build a system, okay, which we call the medicine supply map, okay, and this is really to try and identify, characterize, okay, and quantify risks in the upstream pharmaceutical supply chain, so that you can have a more information, more predictive, okay, as to where a potential shortage is going to be. Okay. The medicine supply map, or the MSM, includes views of, like I mentioned, API and raw material suppliers. Okay? And it aggregates more than 200 million data points, okay, across 92% of the generic prescription medicines in the US. Right? And it leverages about 22,000 locations where, excuse me, okay, in 150 countries, okay, where USP is active in. Okay, and about 20 plus data sets, okay, coming from USP, okay, from FDA, from EMA, as well WHO and private sector sources. Okay? And it's all designed, and the whole medicine supply map is designed, okay, to generate regular insights, reports, and to evaluate structural risks in the medicine supply chain, and therefore be able to have a better prediction of where a potential shortage is going to be. You know, as mentioned, the data across the whole medical supply chain is very fragmented, not standardized. Okay, so here's where an increase in transparency across the whole medicine supply chain is going to be very important. Right? Manufacturers, okay, should okay, provide the types of medicine products that they're manufacturing and at what volumes, sources of where the ingredients are coming from, okay, and also information about the distributors and the resellers and channels and distribution channels. Regulators, okay, should to have access to insights about the manufacturer's site, products, volume, capacity, and be able to share these among all the other regulators around the world. And for pharmacies, the healthcare providers, okay, prescription data will be key to understand the demand, right? And also granular details about the medications dispensed and about drug shortages encountered. Okay, last but not least, manufacturing capability. Now, unlike currently batch manufacturing, okay, where the different ingredients, the different inputs, manufacturing inputs, okay, all finished products, okay, are made in different stages in different parts of the world. Okay. New manufacturing technologies like continuous manufacturing can provide efficiencies that allow inputs to be done in a continuous basis. So in other words, okay, each element will take place in a continuous process. Each element of the manufacturing process will take place in a continuous process in a single facility. Accordingly, continuous manufacturing can help increase output and cost efficiencies and be more agile and flexible to respond to shortages as it happens. Right? So in summary, all this is really done to build trust in patients on the type of medicines that they receive from from the doctors, right? Okay, it's really a recap the 5 elements that we talk about, right? In terms of ingredient and product quality assurance, regulatory capabilities, supply chain security, supply chain transparency, and the manufacturing capability. Okay? And this enables the regulators to be able to enforce quality standards, okay? Manufacturers' ability to be able to adhere to quality standards, and country capabilities to be able to produce and ensure supply and access of quality assured standards, okay? So that patients can trust that they receive the medicines that work safe and work as they should be, right? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. So we're ready to move on to our panel. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Professor John Lim. Professor Lim is the founding executive director of CORE at Duke NUS Medical School, a distinguished healthcare professional and government regulator. Professor Lim has extensive experience, including roles as CEO of Singapore's Health Sciences Authority. He holds postgrad degrees from NUS and Harvard University. Recognized for his leadership, he has received awards like the DIA Global Connector Inspire Award and the Regulatory Affairs Professional Societies Founders Award. Professor Lim, thank you for being here today. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Marie, and it's a great pleasure to be here this morning with you. Thank you very much to Dr. Reddy and to GLC for organizing this wonderful conclave, and also it's a pleasure to engage with all of you this morning. I think I would like to first invite on stage the rest of the panel. Chris Caldwell is already with us virtually, but I'd like to invite Ramesh Raj Kishore and Brett Marshall to the stage. Ramesh is someone I've known for many years, since we were colleagues in the Health Sciences Authority of Singapore. And Ramesh he started his career as a lay prosecutor with HSA, and now he's moved on into really tracking pharmaceutical crime. So he works very much with international organizations and regional organizations to look into substandard and falsified medicines and to deal with those issues at source. And Brett is the Vice President of Quality and Health Safety, Security and Environment in Zuellig Pharma. He has immense experience in ensuring quality of pharmaceutical products. And in fact, he's really trained in logistics, so that's very relevant to our discussion on supply chain issues today. And he's really been in Asia for 30 years, so that's congratulations, Brett, for being part of us for so long. So thank you very much to Anthony for setting the stage for this. And Marie actually highlighted some of the key issues at the beginning and in her introduction. We hope that in the context of this conclave and what Dr. Reddy said yesterday about health resilience, we're able to bring something additional to the table this morning, because as Marie said at the beginning, I think not many people are really fully aware of the issues regarding supply chain matters. And if you are really going to think of health resilience in our health systems, obviously the products, the health products that are available in our health systems, their quality, safety, and efficacy are paramount. And I think Anthony has done a wonderful job in describing USP's sort of mission and also laid out the concerns that we want to address today. So, of course, Anthony has highlighted the key things of shortages. That's a major issue. The bottlenecks that we've seen also, especially during the pandemic, and of course, the very fundamental concern of substandard and falsified medicines. But this then leads to issues of regulatory capacity, whether regulators are adequately sort of leveled up to that. And it's not really just an issue of looking into laboratory testing, it's whether regulators at all levels of the regulatory authorities understand these concerns and are able to ensure safety, quality, and efficacy, especially as we look into new therapeutics coming our way. And there are the issues then of whether local manufacturing is going to help solve some of these concerns. And again, we saw this during the pandemic, where there was unequal access and inequitability of what was available to our populations in this region. And post-pandemic, we've been seeing a lot of efforts to see whether, in fact, there can be more local manufacturing going on. And this is where, again, supply chain becomes an issue. I mean, obviously, you can have a country trying to produce products for its own population, but how much better if they're also producing products for neighboring countries as well? But then the supply chain issues kick in. And so what I would like to do in the remaining 50 minutes that we have is to engage our panel to discuss the issues related to what I've just described, but more importantly, at the end of this, to see whether we can reach some consensus on how we can take things forward in a practical way in terms of collaboration and convergence, and what are the really practical options to solve supply chain issues. So perhaps I would firstly like to ask Chris, because I see you now dominating the screen and towering over us. Do you have any comments to add to what Anthony has already said about supply chain issues, and of course from your past experience in the pharmaceutical industry? And then I'm going to ask Ramesh and Brett to add on a few words. So Chris, over to you, please. Thank you very much, Chris. Ramesh?
Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for having us here. Well, I think I'd like to 30 seconds about PSI so that you can start this conversation. So we have been around for slightly more than 20 years. We were created by the various pharmaceutical companies, and currently we are about 40 pharma strong. The main reason why we were created was to consolidate and share intelligence with various law enforcement agencies. These agencies were Interpol, Europol, as well as the regional respective regulators, customs, and everyone who is sharing the same ecosystem, right? So that's about PSI. So now, I think most of you would be aware that how the supply chain maneuvered before the pandemic and post-pandemic is vastly different. During the time of the pandemic itself, if you have not noticed, 80 to 85% of the world's supply chain slowed down. They slowed down, but that did not stop the movement of the criminal syndicates. Why? Because even during that time, regulators and international law enforcement agencies were still detaining and seizing millions and millions of counterfeit masks and everything that was related, that was required by the healthcare practitioners. 9 months, even before the vaccine came out by Pfizer, we were already looking at people selling them on the streets, under trees, coming out from Africa, Mexico, even closer to home, Vietnam. How was this possible? Were they getting their hands on the supply chain faster than the actual supply chain itself? Clearly not. We also realized that, especially in the Asian region, the manner that we embrace technology improved or caught up by 5 years. Outside of China and India, with 650 million people embracing technology, what happened was everybody started buying everything online. I'm sure most of us did it here as well. But how does that involve the supply chain? When we were engaging the customs, we realized that the orders that were coming in was very, very large, but they were also in small packages. Now, tracing things in small packages poses a whole different challenge itself. So earlier, Anthony started about, looking into regulators' capacity. We were dealing with that, and we very quickly understood that in ASEAN, the manner or priorities were different. The infrastructures was different. How various regulators adopted certain protocols were also different. While first world countries were speeding things up and collecting awards after awards, caught in the sandwich were the ones who were trying to look for partners to work with. And of course, those who were underdeveloped or coming up in the system, they were totally clueless. Because what you had was investments coming in from third-party countries, fly-by-night pharmacies, healthcare institutions that were already flooded, criminal syndicates penetrating into everything. You have your ransomware. And, the problems just multiplied. So 3 years on the road, we are now looking into how we can still strengthen the partnership with various regulators, with USP, with Zulik, even with CORE as well. And we bring in regulators to educate them, to make them understand. And of course, our core function is PSI's core function, sharing vital intelligence with them. And I think I'll just start the base for that conversation, not to hog the line. And then, Brad.
Thank you very much, Ramesh. Actually, it's quite a sobering summary of the issues because I think it's not an area we're usually aware of when we think of criminal syndicates working to sort of disrupt. They don't really try to disrupt. They're trying to get profits from it, but they end up disrupting healthcare systems because of their effect. So thank you very much, Ramesh. Brett, over to you, please.
Thanks, John. I think one of the, as Zulik Pharma, just very quickly, we have a presence in 18 countries, all in Asia, and our distribution operations are predominantly 14 markets. We represent more than 500 manufacturers and delivering to more than 220,000 customers, end customers for us being hospitals, medical centres, pharmacies, drugstores, etc. And probably one of the largest cold chain management footprints in Asia also. So those operations are very much enabled by the quality systems that Chris and Anthony have been talking about. And those quality management systems that we implement through the facilities that we have, more than 80 warehouses across that footprint, are very much aligned and driven by international standards, ICH, PICS, MHRA, EMA, US FDA, predominantly WHO. And that structures international standards that meet the requirements of our international client base. We drive that down through the operations and through the deliveries that we're conducting across that geographic footprint. Generally speaking, those standards are higher than we see in many of the specific markets that we're delivering into, but we are seeing regulatory convergence through particularly PICS membership and also the work that USP is doing with the regulators themselves and driving that convergence, because harmonisation in its truest form has not been achieved in a long time now. But we are starting to see that regulatory alignment across all the markets. So the legitimate side of the supply chain is well managed. I think one of the things that we identified out of COVID was that a supply chain is not necessarily a linear relationship, but it is very much a network, a supply network with multiple levels of suppliers. And I think when we look at the context of health delivery systems more broadly, that segmentation also exists when we're talking about how the public sector respond to delivering health to patients and to the community as well. So this stakeholder management concept at multiple levels was really brought home as being highly critical out of COVID, and areas that, for example, packaging suppliers that may not have been on our priority list all of a sudden weren't in a position to be able to manufacture, and that potentially had an impact on our ability to supply services. So moving out of the pandemic period and making sure that the relationships with the partners that we have at the different levels is well established. And it's not now just a discussion about price of service. It's a discussion about how do we build the relationship around quality, around health and safety, around compliance, around sustainability, to be able to make sure that the resilience of those relationships for future events is already in place. Because as we heard yesterday, there was some discussion about environmental surveillance, and I think from a supply chain perspective, that's something that we are acutely aware of. It's not just pandemics for us, but we talked about some of the climate-related events that impact operations. And back in 2021, when Typhoon Odette hit Cebu, where we have a 10,000 square metre warehouse and it ripped the roof off the warehouse, how do we continue to operate in that context? How do we maintain electricity supplies using a generator that requires fuel, requiring government support to make sure that we have uninterrupted access to fuel? These are relationships that we've started to put in place. And I think something that was one of our key takeaways is really how we start to work with governments and with regulators much more closely to support not just our business, not just patient access and patient safety, but also managing future such events.
Thank you very much, Brett. You've raised a lot of important issues, and we'll come back to those later as we try and wrap up the session to see how we can bring all these points together, because as we've said, the supply chain is a very complex system. But I'd like to come back to Anthony for a while. In your presentation, you talked about the medicine supply map, USP's initiative there, bringing transparency to the upstream supply chain. Could you tell us a bit more about how the MSM really works to identify issues and quantify risk in the supply of medicines as a kind of very sort of practical outworking of the initiative?
Oops, is this on? Yeah, okay. I actually had a slide on an example of how it works, which I didn't show, right? Okay. What the medicine supply map does is, okay, it looks at where the API or raw material manufacturer is and where it goes to, which manufacturer. And you see that for one, example, one particular supplier, okay, you'll be able to trace to which manufacturers it goes to, and then from there you start tracing all the way down to which countries, right, which plant, okay, that it goes to, and from there when you can trace. So when a quality issue happens somewhere upstream, you can actually then be able to trace downstream, right? So you can actually then predict, okay, where the potential quality is going to be. Right? The other thing that the medicine supply map does is, okay, we also look at various other attributes as well, or call it attributes, right? Quality, geographical location, competition, pricing, okay, and we have developed a kind of a algorithm where you can then create the resilience score. An example that we did was actually on doxorubicin in the US, okay, where we looked at all these factors and we saw that the resilience score was actually what we call a minus 0.4, which means there's a potential shortage coming up from there.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, before I let you go, you also talked about advanced manufacturing technology. Just a declaration, I'm also involved with USP as the Asia Pacific Chapter Chair, and last year when we were in Rockville, there was a great deal of interest from countries in the region to understand more about advanced manufacturing. And again, you touched on this in your presentation. And linking to what I was saying earlier about post-pandemic, where countries are now looking a lot more into local manufacturing, can you say a bit about how advanced manufacturing feeds into this, and what is the implication and impact on the supply chain?
You know, currently, right, batch manufacturing, where you have different elements of manufacturing taking place in different countries, okay? APIs manufactured in a certain country, okay, then it gets shipped to another country where finished product is done, and sometimes, you know, even then the drug substance, okay, is shipped off to another country for repackaging, okay? So continuous manufacturing allows all these, okay, to be done in a single facility, okay? So I'm not really an expert in this, so I will just say, but really it's about providing the flexibility and the agility to respond to any changes in demand, okay, by having inputs of the materials, okay, in a particular plant, okay, and then as the output comes out, okay, you can continually keep changing according to the demand from it. So you can manufacture smaller batches, more cost efficient, and being able to provide access to already quality assured medicines in a very much faster response.
Thank you very much. Again, because Chris is looming over us, I cannot sort of ignore you. But Anthony made the point that the USP is really the only pharmacopoeia that is not a government pharmacopoeia. And now, as you've just taken on this new role of looking at international collaboration, can you say a bit about how you see this panning out and the importance of not just USP's initiatives, but the partners that you work with in terms of strengthening supply chains across the region to strengthen health resilience?
opportunities for collaboration. And this is also by saying that one of the things that John, as you mentioned, you're going to chair our Asia Pacific chapter. We are launching regional chapters around the world. And the idea behind that is to really tap into insights and expertise around the world, get those collective learnings, and then together be able to strengthen the standards that we apply regardless of what country we're operating in.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'd like to swing back to Brett now, because you raised the issue just now of harmonization when you made your opening remarks. What is your assessment of the state of play of harmonization during the pandemic and now as we move out of it? And what are the kind of key sort of areas that still need addressing that would really contribute to strengthening the supply chain from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, John, and it has been, when we operate across so many different markets, it has been interesting to watch how the maturity has improved over the last decade. And as I think I touched on, I think I've seen PICS as being, as a standard, as being the primary driver of that. We now have, I think, 16 or 17 PICS members. China's just put its application in as well. So that's what I think is driving a certain level of convergence, and a pretty high level actually. And I think also the activity of ICH, they've been much more active, particularly here in Asia. I think just before the pandemic, they had one of their chapter meetings here in Singapore. So I think there's a general awareness by the regulators in the market, and whether it's in the more developed markets or the low to middle income markets, we're still seeing that maturity improving. I think they need support. I think that there is still enormous opportunity for supporting skill set development and competency development in not just the documentation of standards, but how you actually implement and how you put, vigilance across those with the stakeholders you have in the markets. I think that's the most challenging part for most regulators, and really drives some of the challenges that Ramesh was talking about too, in terms of counterfeit, falsified, substandard medicines.
And Brett, before again I let you go, now that the WHO has introduced this maturity level rating for regulators, and we're talking of WHO listed authorities as well, to indicate sort of reference agencies, as it were, for enhancing standards across regulation. What is your perspective on this in terms of helping to address some of these issues you've highlighted?
I think it's good. We talked about, I think a little earlier, about external benchmarking, and how you have to look externally to identify benchmarks to follow. And I think that the maturity model gives that framework for the countries to look at. So we've had Singapore, who is level 4 maturity. Korea's also now level 4 maturity. There are markets that are struggling. Most markets at level 3, and the Philippines, I think, is still level 1, and they clearly need some support. It's not a question of desire, because the Philippine FDA is very passionate about how it can develop its capabilities further, but there are issues they need to deal with, which go beyond how we can support that process as well.
Thank you very much. Ramesh, over to you again. Please say a bit more now about these issues we've been talking about in terms of the criminal activities, substandard falsified medicines, and what Brett has just been talking about in terms of maturity levels and harmonization. How does that feed into what you are doing? And also on the converse aspect, from what you are doing in terms of strengthening systems, how does that support this whole strengthening of supply chains and regulation?
Okay, so that's a very loaded question. So,
yeah, well, I thought you could take a loaded question. So,
well, I think when we look at the macro view of a supply chain, import, export, ensure that the manufacturing is good, no integrity issues, it reaches to the other country, all is good and well. But when you start looking into the granular level, it is until the point of time where the product actually reaches the consumer, the patient. Now, within that, like what Brett mentioned, there are several levels of complexity. Post-COVID, we have realized that there are criminal syndicates now who have perfected the art of the packaging to the font size, the depth of the font, the spacing in between the font, the color, the package material. But of course, the blister packs are all diverted from other hotspot countries, and the product itself is counterfeit. And if the packaging itself contains a hologram, those hologram, of course, either could belong to somebody else or it's just there for aesthetic purpose. There are multiple permutations, and these permutations are not very far off. They're all in Asia. The problems that happens in Asia will be the problem of everyone else in a year or two. That's how creative and how fast we move. Coupled with the fact that now criminal syndicates are moving into cryptocurrency and Bitcoin as well. We start working with different banks. We start working with the cybercrime team in Interpol, transferring vast amount of intelligence just to identify suspected criminal syndicates and following the money. Now, when we are talking about different levels of complexity, of course, there are different levels of offenses that are being committed along the way. So now, as a policy driver, when you're driving the policy, would you be able to have the foresight of future-proofing a policy? Clearly not possible. The law, whether you like it or not, will always be playing catch-up to criminals. It is only when a new kind of offense or a criminal trend is identified, then we review our policies, we review the legislative aspect, and we try to bring it up to the current situation, or play catch up. How many countries are able to do that? How many partners are willing to endure with that kind of patience and work with them? Earlier we mentioned also, first world countries are busy collecting accolades after accolades, while other countries, Philippines, I was just there over the weekend, are having trouble even with the post-market surveillance system. Post-market surveillance system for any drug regulators is a primary basic concern. If you are having challenges there, let's not talk about anything beyond that. So there are countries who really want their help, and there are countries who are already there. Of course, when we identify countries who need the assistance, we can now jump in together collectively and say, here we are, what is it that you need? How can we help you? In terms of policy review, policy modification, legislative requirements, or partnering with the right people to enhance capabilities. Now, what about those who are already collecting all the accolades? What is their appetite? In my opinion, being a former regulator, you should be seen as spearheading these initiatives. You should be coming out and telling the others, hey, we have over the years now implemented an infrastructure where we are able to combat these issues. You may not be able to adopt it, apple for apple, but there are certain functions where you can see and adopt and improve on, depending on your criteria. How many such countries have done that? Just to give everybody context, when Prof. John was the CEO for HSA, he was one of the first few drug regulators to sign an MOU with Interpol. It was during that time when we started Operation Pangea, and in a spate of 5 years, we did so many things for ASEAN country regulators, train-the-train programs, and HSA was one of the first few people even to come out to draft the rapid alert system, which has now gone through different phases of modifications. Can first world countries replicate this? Perhaps. Again, each country has its own appetite, each country has its own goals they want to achieve, so there are different tiers. And of course now coupled with technology, if you don't embrace it, you are literally lost. It's not only about e-commerce and social media platforms that we're looking at. We are now looking at metaverse as well. We are now looking at consultation clinics opening up in the metaverse and giving consultation and telling you to pick up your prescriptions in another fly-by-night pharmacies. How do you detect all this? Only by sharing technology, only by sharing intelligence, understanding technology, and sharing those. So we have to bring like-minded peoples together. Public-private partnership must come together. So when you say supply chain, for me it's an entire whole different universe that has a multitude of challenges, which of course over time we can overcome. But again, the patience.
Thank you very much. There's a very eloquent and powerful commentary, Ramesh. And I think it's important for this conclave to think about because, we've been talking about partnerships and collaboration from yesterday, but this is an aspect, I think, which is usually off the radar for most of us because we are thinking of public health, global health, One Health. But to realize that we can't achieve this if we're not addressing these very fundamental issues that are sort of working on the fringes in the dark, as it were. So I think perhaps this is a critical takeaway as well, that we have to look at these kind of issues as well at intergovernment levels and interagency levels. So thank you very much, Ramesh. I'd like to open up to the participants at this point. Are there any questions you'd like to pose? I see one here. Oh, many hands. We'll start with table 8 first and then slowly move our way around. Is there a microphone for table 8? Maybe if you raise your hand again.
Thanks very much, John and team, for a great discussion. I actually have 2 questions. One is having to do with public-private partnerships. Now, you've touched on public-private partnerships in a number of different ways, but I'm wondering to what extent you see public-private partnerships working in terms of the delivery of supplies and medicines, especially in low-income contexts, right? So I can go to a very remote village anywhere in the world and I can find Coca-Cola and Doritos, okay? That's not necessarily what I'm looking for, but, that's what you can find. But you can't find the drugs that are needed at the primary care organization. So how much... what are there some good practices that are emerging in terms of public-private partnerships, particularly in Asia or in low-income country contexts? The second question is, and Anthony has already touched on this a little bit, is the role of AI. So some of the countries in Asia, one where I work, Indonesia, they're talking a lot about using AI for better performance in terms of supply chain management, and they're pushing various donors to put money into AI to help them do this. And I'm just wondering, what would be your advice based on your own experience?
Thank you. I think for the first question, I'll ask Brett to respond.
I think across particularly the low middle income countries, we see probably more preference for public-private partnerships to kind of build capabilities into the market. So Cambodia is an example that had, during the pandemic, vaccines coming from a number of different sources, but primarily through a combination of private sector supply chain capability and NGO, UNICEF vaccine distribution capability. And I think that's kind of building. We're starting to see further collaborative education programs with the national immunisation programs of some of these markets to build further capability, build the skill sets from management and the understanding of supply chain and the potential to improve the networks to provide safe and efficacious medicines and vaccines to patients. I think that's probably the best example, but I think you see examples of that in some of the other markets as well.
Chris, would you like to add to that as well? Commentary on public-private partnerships and LMIC situations? Thank you. Anthony, would you like to take the second question on AI?
I will try. I think at the fundamental level, it's about standardizing the data, right? Getting the kind of information you need. Okay, you go to AI different. I don't know. I'm not a computer expert again. Okay, where you have different languages, different things, and how you standardize everything. I think that's the key thing. Okay, standardizing the data is I think the most important. And of course, the next bit is about being willing to share the data. Right? I think being willing to share the data, we find different countries, different regulators, they have different requirements. Sometimes they say this is confidential, we can't share this and all. Manufacturers also, I can't share with you production capacity, for example. Okay, so two things, right? Standardizing the data and being willing to share the data. I think that's the key thing, okay? Before you can even talk about AI.
Brett?
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think, supply chain technology, which is developed in industries outside healthcare, has evolved very quickly. And so there are core forms of AI already being used in many of these software platforms, and increasingly so, I think, as we develop control tower capabilities that start to integrate the different data sources and create greater end-to-end visibility. That's the objective. I think that it's not they're not open AI systems. I forget the term itself, but the ability to use AI to drive transparency across the different nodes of supply chain, the different stakeholders, the monitoring capabilities in terms of location and temperature and shock and those types of things, I think offer great opportunities, particularly with AI.
I'd just like to add that at a sort of broader macro level, AI governance is quite critical, right? And ensuring data security as well. So in fact, in my center, we are holding a roundtable in a month's time, more on the Singapore context, to look at AI governance, because one of the key issues is the regulatory regimes for AI are very, very nascent and underdeveloped. And our sense is there needs to be a lot more conversation among governments at this point and regulators to ensure consistency of the regulatory regimes. Otherwise, we will end up with a situation a bit like in the pharmaceutical sector, where many years down the road, you find a great divergence of regulatory regimes, and you're trying to then force-fit harmonization after the fact. So I think this is really a window of opportunity which we need to develop, and it's obviously going to affect the supply chain in a positive way, but it's also going to affect healthcare and digital health in a very significant way as well. Sorry, Dr. Reddy, I'm just going to let the lady go first and then come back to you. Yes, please. Oh, your microphone is not working?
Okay, thank you. Trish Naina-Schwedler from Heidelberg University in Germany and Climate Action Accelerator. I'll be quick because there's other people that need to ask questions as well. I hear resilience and security and strong and robust, but I'm surprised in 2024 not to hear environmentally sustainable. Sustainability was mentioned once, but more in terms of the impact of climate change on the supply chain and not the impact of the supply chain on the environment. And this is not just because healthcare needs to first do no harm, but there's also now a very strong argument in terms of the economic argument and also the quality assurance argument. So healthcare contributes 5% of global emissions, that's 8.5% in the USA, and most of these emissions are scope 3, 2/3 of the emissions are scope 3, so that's supply chain. So sustainability is now considered a domain of quality in healthcare, so we extend the responsibility of health, not just to patients today, but also in the future. And at the WHO ATTACH meeting last week, that's the Alliance for Transformation on Climate Change and Health, it was highlighted that the supply chain, a sustainable supply chain is not just a nice to have now, but it's actually a must. So I'm just wondering, if it's not considered a compliance issue today, it certainly will be in the future, and the consequences for that will be applied retrospectively. So I would like to know what USP are doing to reduce emissions and environmental impact of the supply chain. Should it not be considered one of the 5 elements of the resilient supply chain? And have you measured your carbon footprint? Do you have a target to decarbonise, and do you have a mitigation strategy?
Thank you very much. Very important question. Can I ask Chris to respond, please?
Pharmaceuticals and also medical devices, they have a carbon footprint. The challenges that we have oftentimes, I think, is a balance between some of the quality externality aspects, actually, and the environmental impact. We have to make sure that the products that we develop are clean, are sterilized, and the equipment is clean and sterilized. And it requires a lot of energy, a lot of chemicals, unfortunately, to get to that place. So I must say that I know the industry, both in my pharmaceutical days and medical device days, are very much looking at this. And again, for a moment, taking myself out of my USP, when I was in my medical device days, this particularly became a point of conversation in Europe. And I think Europe is generally in a region that is quite progressive in some of these environmental issues. And what we started to actually do is in the procurement specifications for some of the medical devices to actually have some of that scoring component on environmental impact. I don't know the details of all that, but it's interesting to see where that's going, and I'm going to imagine that trend continues. So I'd like to get down to USP, and with the caveat that I'm 3 months into the role, I will say that we do see that we have a role in this. We're very much actively looking at the standards that we develop. What is the environmental footprint of those standards? What are the opportunities for us to improve that, but at the same time, maintaining the level of quality assurance that we need to have that trust, to have that confidence? So that's an excellent question. I can tell we're very much looking at that as one of our priorities going into what we call our next cycle. We probably have a whole panel discussion on that. I just want to thank you for that. And so it is top of mind, both for industry and also for USP.
Yes, Brett.
Just very, very quickly, it's with the clients we have, and as Chris said, predominantly coming from Europe, there are very clear targets and requirements being set in the contractual arrangements that are being deployed in procurement exercises. And also, for a company like Zuellig Pharma, we recognise we represent a significant proportion of Scope 3 emissions for our clients. So it's not just, contractual pressure that's driving our efforts in sustainability, but also our own internal organisational sustainability objectives. We have objectives, a subcommittee on the board, the leadership's fully engaged. We've been EcoVadis Platinum certified 3 years running. It's a very, very big part of the responsibility of all the leadership team in our company. And I think that's being reflected through the markets that we operate as well.
Thank you very much. Dr. Reddy, please.
Yeah. Just one question in terms of further going upstream. One of the resilience aspect is towards a novel pathogen emerging. If a novel pathogen emerges, the research and development ecosystem that is required for a country or for the region to come up with rapid diagnostics and the rapid vaccines or the rapid drugs. Are we discussing that component also as a part of supply chain resilience? Because that is what exactly we faced during the COVID, that we didn't have the diagnostic, we didn't have the drugs, we didn't have the vaccines. And what came out is that to be resilient, you need to have even those platforms prepared for a potential novel pathogen to emerge. So that was one question with reference to a resilience component. Just a second question, while most of the discussion focused on the drugs, and again, within the therapeutics, if I expand from the drugs to the therapeutics, we are now moving from drugs to the molecular, the genetic, and the digital therapeutics. Not only that, in terms of the supplies, the diagnostics have become equally vital in terms of the people's health. So we haven't covered these elements of that. So these are the two questions to be part of an overall supply chain resilience, the R&D ecosystem, self-sufficiency, as well as the emerging therapeutics apart from the drugs.
I think the short answer, Dr. Reddy, is yes to both, because obviously I think these must form part of the supply chain landscape and ecosystem. But it's a very complex issue, and that whole area you've talked about in terms of the upstream is a whole area of work that is ongoing amongst governments and regulators and organizations at this point in time to ensure that we are much better prepared for another pandemic, to ensure that, in fact, as research is evolving and unfolding, that all the partners are coming together. And of course, you see this, I think, even across governments now in terms of strengthening the whole emerging infectious disease sort of landscape. And I think this probably has not been traditionally sort of part of the understanding of supply chain as we've been discussing this morning. But your point is well taken that it does need to feed into it. But it's a whole sort of area, I think, in its own right, which could therefore be a whole panel as well in its own right. Chris, just a quick word from you. Do you have any thoughts on this?
You don't know who the therapies go to. You have to have the medical devices to deliver the therapies. We learned through the COVID pandemic, but also through previous the H1N1. You need to have the vaccine, you need to have the delivery devices. Through diagnostics, I can share without any secrets, the company I was working with, we produced some diagnostics for COVID-19. One of the things we actually were afraid of were the nasal swabs. I think about that. People want to have a child with nasal swabs, but it's not just a Q-tip that you get at the pharmacy. be vigilant across the entire supply chain and across the healthcare continuum. We certainly still have vulnerabilities, but I think, again, looking for the silver lining, I think the level of awareness coming out of the pandemic is higher, and we certainly have our work cut out for us to continue to improve.
I would just add one more point before I ask for the last question. Also from a regulatory perspective, and this is work that my center's been doing, as we went through the pandemic, we saw that there were a lot of silos, even in terms of the way regulation was viewed. And one of the key themes that we're looking at this year is the converging of health products and health services regulation. So that it doesn't directly respond to your question, but it does say that we are functioning a lot in silos, not just in the supply chain issue, but across the health system. And we need to look more at the continuum of issues. So I think this is a kind of mindset change we need to look at. And even the good thing about, as we're talking about One Health especially, we're forcing ourselves to look across outside the normal partners when we're thinking of health resilience. But it's a move we must continue to progress on. So, yes, please. Now, yours will have to be the final question. If you don't mind, we can continue discussing over tea after this. Please, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. This is Alessio Sperato from the Asian Development Bank. My question is actually quite similar to your question. There's a debate inside the bank as to what extent we should be working on climate mitigation versus adaptation in Asian countries. And my understanding is that 70% of the global emissions from healthcare actually come from the supply chain, of which 70% is upstream manufacturing, right? Manufacturing processes. Now, I was wondering what potential this has here in Asia, right? I'm no expert in the pharma market, right? But most pharma seem to be owned by high-income countries, right? So I was wondering to what extent this can be addressed in low and middle income countries, and what would such an agenda look like? Thank you.
Maybe I'll have to look to Brett again.
Thank you. I'll try my best to answer this. I think there has been strong focus on emissions, and this is being driven. A lot of it is coming out of the regulation that's emerging from Europe, in particular, the Supply Chain Act from Germany, which will certainly be, if it's not already, it's in the process of being duplicated by the European Union government anyway. So that regulatory tool is really influencing the behaviour of manufacturers, and so the manufacturers themselves are working very closely with companies like ours in a partnership, looking at specific areas that we can target to assist them in their emissions reduction. Now, manufacturing still makes up a big proportion of their overall emissions, yes. But even if I take a step away from just the emissions, there are broader issues for us in a sustainability context when we start to talk about diversity, equity and inclusion, about human rights, about health and safety in workplaces and those sorts of things. So as much as it's a discussion about emissions, it's also, there are some very strong social contexts that we need also to have dialogue around in the markets that we operate. And sustainability is not just about the emissions aspect.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry we couldn't take all your questions during the session, but please feel free to interact with the panel after this. But I'd like to certainly thank wonderful panelists, for Anthony for his presentation earlier, for Chris, for Ramesh, and for Brett. I think as you've seen from the discussion, we started the session already saying that the supply chain issue is a complex one, but we've seen that it's even more complex than we think. So of course, it's even more critical that as we go forward from this conclave and in other fora, that we continue this engagement and discussion, because there are very pressing issues, areas that Ramesh has touched on that we don't normally think about, but that will affect health resilience and the welfare of the patients, whether in high income or LMIC situations. But clearly, I think, as we're thinking of supply chain issues, collaboration is most critical, and the need for ongoing conversation is paramount. So I think this is something that it's not just a talk show or talk fest that we're having this morning, but it must actually translate into follow-up and follow-through. So I think with that sort of broad comment, because I think there's so many deep dive issues we could go into, it just feeds, I think, into the rest of the conclave and the understanding that working together is very fundamental and critical if we're really going to achieve the mission of strengthening health resilience. So with that, please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you for your attention and participation.